Welcome to Chapel Online with Dawn Daly. This is our third chapel, and we are on our fourth judge. Some of you guys may actually know him, Gideon. I call him the big chicken judge, and you'll see why. Now, after Deborah, things were good for a while, but then the Jews went back and did evil in the sight of the Lord. And of course, God wants to bring his people back to himself. So he allowed some nomads from the east called the Midianites. They rode camels and they just went from place to place. Well, God allowed them to come in and take over a large portion of Israel. And they would come in when the harvest was good. And they would move in and take all the Jews' food and all of their animals. To the point that the Jews were so afraid, they would actually, in this time while they had set up camp, go hide in caves and dens and strongholds. It was a horrible time for the Jews. And this one, after 7 years, the Jews finally cried out to God and asked for help. And God answered. He sent a prophet. We don't know his name, but we do know his message. And his message was, look, God got you out of Egypt and he didn't leave you. He's not left you now. But you do need to remember you did wrong in the sight of the Lord. You turned away from him. You worshiped false gods. And so now it's time for God to call the next judge. So we pick up our story in Ophrah. I know, weird name for a town. But we're on this farm and there's a man named Gideon that has been able to hide some of his grain from the Midianites. So he's hiding in this wine press, trying to get the grain off of the sheaves of wheat. They call it thrashing. And this angel of the Lord greeted him and said, "Valiant warrior, the Lord God is with you." And Gideon's response immediately was, if God is really with us, then why did this horrible thing happen? Now, I think there's something that we can learn from this, because Gideon is expressing something that we all think sometimes. Well, if God is really with me, then this bad thing wouldn't happen. Now, we have the advantage of seeing the big picture. We can look at the book of Judges and go, God's doing something. He's got a plan. He let the Midianites come in and take over to get your attention. We have that advantage. But when the bad thing is happening to us, we sometimes forget that God's got a plan and he's a good God. He is doing something and that God is with us. Now, the angel told him, God is going to use you, Gideon, to free his people from the Midianites. And Gideon immediately breaks out in excuses. Me? What do I know? I'm from the smallest, most insignificant tribe. I'm nobody. But God spoke to Gideon and said, I am with you. And so Gideon wanted a sign to make sure that this was for real. So he went and prepared a meal for this angel, brought it out to him, and the angel put down his staff and consumed this meal with fire. And at that moment, Gideon realized this wasn't just an angel. This was God looking like a person. And he was so afraid, he just knew, I've come face to face with God. I'm going to die. And God said, do not fear, Gideon. You will not die. So God told Gideon that night, I want you to go and destroy the altars to Baal, the false god that the Midianites had brought in and that the Jews were worshiping. So Gideon did what God told him to. He went into town with 10 men that night and took down the altar to Baal that his father had put up. Well, the next morning, the town people are outraged. They want to kill him. And his father said, look, if Baal is real, then let Baal take care of this. Let Baal go and get him, and you guys just leave him alone. And that satisfied the people. And Gideon took that as a sign that God was really with him. God protected him. Well, now it was time to go into battle. Gideon knew he was going against a huge army of 100,000 Midianites. So it's time for battle. And Gideon knows this is getting serious. So he wanted to make sure that the Lord was with him. So he asked God for another sign. Now, God doesn't want us to ask for signs. He wants us to just trust him. But God was kind and gracious and gave Gideon a sign. So Gideon took a piece of fleece, that's what they get from sheep, and he laid it in his yard out on the farm and said, when I wake up in the morning, let the fleece be wet and the ground be dry. You know, dew first thing in the morning. So he goes out there, and sure enough, the ground is dry. He picks up the fleece, wrings it out, and it's wet. He asks God, okay, I need just one more sign to make sure this is really you before we step out and do this. He said, now I'm going to put out the fleece and let the ground be wet and the fleece be dry. Then I'll know it's you telling me to go into battle. So sure enough, the next morning he gets up, the ground is wet, but the fleece is dry. And so Gideon goes out to the Jews and calls the men to go to battle. Now there were 32,000 men. And God said, Gideon, your army's too big. If you win, then everybody think you did it. Send home everybody that's afraid. 22,000 men went home. If you do mental math, that's only 10,000 men left. So Gideon started working with those 10,000 men. So Gideon and his men were practicing, fighting, and working on rushing down the mountain. They were preparing for battle. And they came down to the creek water. And Gideon noticed something. Most of the men just threw down their shields, their swords, dove in face first into the water. They were so thirsty. The Bible says they drank like dogs. But a few of the men kept their swords, knelt down, and scooped up the water. And Gideon knew those were the men that he was going to take into battle. I call them the scoopers. So Gideon had his men, only 300. But this way God knew that he would get the glory. So it was time to suit up his soldiers, Gideon's 300. They all had a pot and a torch and a horn. Probably not as big as this one, but they did use animal horns to make horns. Gideon, in the dead of night, took his 300 men up into the mountains surrounding the Midianite army's camp. They hid their torches under their pots, and on Gideon's signal, they all threw off the pots, broke them, screamed to the top of their lungs, and started blowing their horns. Well, it scared the Midianite army so badly. I mean, they were sleeping, they woke up, they came out of their tents, they were so confused, they started fighting and killing each other. They were so afraid when they looked up into the mountains and heard all that racket and saw all of Gideon's men. So Gideon and his men went after the Midianite army that was left and ran the Midianites out forever. Fun fact, this is actually called a shofar, and it is a ram's horn. Going into battle, they probably used some that were really small, but this would start all their festivals, signal that they were going into battle. I'm not very good at it, but I'll let you guys see. Yeah, here we go. Does that sound scary or what? So as we go back and look at this amazing story of Gideon, he is a man of valor. Look what he did. He barged into battle with just 300 men. We see him being willing to go against everybody in town to break down the altar of a false god. And even though he knew people would not like it, he did what God told him to. Now, I always thought that he kind of started out as a chicken. But when we look at his response to God, when God told him, you are a man of great valor, God is with you. His immediate response is, if God was with me, why do you let this happen? That's where his fear was coming from, is not believing that God was with him. And notice with every single time that God spoke to him, what did God assure him of? God is with you. I am with you. I'm going with you to tear down this altar to Baal. I am going with you to train these men. I'm going with you into this battle with just 300 against an army of 100,000. His fear was conquered with believing that God is with him. Now, I think that is definitely something that each of us need to learn. We tend to have fear about things because we don't think God's in control or that God's not right there. This reminds me of a story years ago when Mr. Phil and I, my husband, we first bought our kayaks. And I did not spend a lot of time on the water as a kid or as an adult. He had much more experience than I did. And we were out on a river out in North Georgia with some friends of ours and my niece. Now, my niece is an adult, but, you know, I'm her aunt. I'm supposed to protect her. Well, it'd been raining a lot that summer and the rivers were raging. And we'd already had some trouble getting into the river. And as we were going down, and we were going pretty fast because the water was flowing so quickly. But Phil, my husband, noticed a kayak flipped over in the trees on the banks of the river. So he wanted to go check it out and make sure there was nobody in there. Well, he was over there for a while. And we kind of kept going a little bit ahead of him when we realized no one was in danger. And my niece, she had her life vest but did not have it on her. Because the river was so crazy, she actually flipped over. And we spent a good 10 minutes trying to get her back into her kayak. Our neighbors were with us and we were holding the kayak and it wasn't happening. She was starting to panic and start getting tired. And it was because we were trying to do something that shouldn't be done in the water. And all I kept thinking is if Phil was here, he would know what to do, because I knew he had a lot more experience in kayaks and on the water than any of us did. And I couldn't paddle back to go to him, but I started trying to paddle back and I started screaming for him. Phil, we need you, help. And they're still trying to get my niece into her kayak. And so Phil finally hears me screaming and he comes down and I'm like, Jessica's falling out of her kayak. We don't know what to do. And he goes, well, let go. What? He says, let go. You can't get her back in the kayak in the water. Throw her life vest. And we floated down the river a little bit and she swam over to the banks and we took her kayak over there. And so we got her off, the side and got her back in her kayak. She put her life vest on and we kept going. And that's just one of those things that my husband is great at. Problem solving. What do we need to do to fix this problem? And I knew if Bill was there, he would fix it. If Bill was there, he would know what to do. And that story always makes me think about believing that God is there. We are fearful because we don't believe that God is there in the situation. But the greatest promise that Jesus gave us, as a matter of fact, the last thing that Jesus said before he went up to heaven to his disciples, and actually that carries out for all of us, is I am with you always to the end of the age. Even in the midst of all the crazy stuff happening right now, whatever you're afraid of, if it's that you're afraid you're not going to be able to do online learning, if it's you're afraid you're going to get sick, if it's afraid that you're not going to have enough toilet paper. Guys, our fears are out of not believing what Jesus told us. I am with you. I'm going to take care of you. And even if it's bad, I'm still right here. I'm going to walk through it with you. Step. And so guys, when you get done with this video, I want you to think about the things that you're afraid of. What are you fearful of right now? And I want you to talk to God about it. Tell him what you're afraid of. Tell him why you're afraid. But guys, then I want you to remember that God is right there with you. Jesus is right there with you, even though you can't see him. And ask God to help you know that, to change your fears, to conquer your fears with his presence, knowing that God is right there with you. And when we remember that, we are able to step out in faith, because no matter what happens, if God is right there, well, he's going to take care of and do what needs to be done. I love you guys, And I miss you, and I hope you had fun with the story of Gideon. But until next week, I leave you guys with a big hug and a virtual high five. Bye.